In the space of 24 hours, Harry S. Truman transformed from a little-known vice president into the most powerful leader in the free world. He inherited a war on two fronts, a dying alliance with the Soviet Union and a secret so devastating that its revelation left him visibly shaken. This is the story of Truman's first day as president, a day marked by fear, by secrets kept from the American people and their own vice president, and by a briefing so terrifying it would haunt Truman for the rest of his life. Why does this day matter? Because it represents one of the most dramatic transitions of power in American history. Because it reveals how unprepared the United States government was for presidential succession during wartime, and because the decisions made in those first hours would echo through the remainder of the 20th century. This is not a story of heroes and villains. It is a story of institutions, of secrecy, and of one man thrust into circumstances no amount of preparation could have readied him for. To understand Truman's shock on April 12th, we must first understand who Harry Truman was, and more importantly, who he was not. Born in 1884 in rural Missouri, Truman's path to the presidency was unlikely. He worked as a farmer, served in World War I as an artillery captain, and failed in the haberdashery business. His entry into politics came through the Pendergast machine in Kansas City, a political organization known more for its corruption than its idealism. Truman served as a county judge, then as a U.S. senator, starting in 1935. His colleagues initially dismissed him as a political hack, but during World War II, he earned respect leading the Senate Special Committee to investigate the National Defense Program. The Truman Committee, as it became known, saved billions of dollars by exposing waste and fraud in military contracts. By 1944, Franklin Roosevelt was preparing for his fourth presidential campaign. Roosevelt's health was deteriorating, though few outside his inner circle knew the extent of his illness. The selection of a vice president suddenly carried enormous weight. Roosevelt's existing vice president, Henry Wallace, was considered too liberal by party leaders and Southern Democrats. After intense convention politicking, party bosses settled on Truman, a moderate with appeal to both labor and the border states. Truman was informed of his selection with little ceremony. He was, by most accounts, reluctant. He understood that Roosevelt's health made the vice presidency more significant than usual, but he could not have imagined how soon he would assume the presidency. On January 20th, 1945, Harry Truman was sworn in as vice president. Over the next 82 days, he would meet with President Roosevelt only twice. He was not invited to cabinet meetings. He was not briefed on military strategy. He knew nothing of the Manhattan Project. He knew nothing of the deteriorating relationship with Stalin. He knew nothing of Roosevelt's secret agreements at Yalta. Roosevelt's inner circle, men like Harry Hopkins, Averell Harriman, and Secretary of War Henry Stimson, regarded Truman as an outsider. They protected Roosevelt's secrets, believing the president would recover or at least survive until the war's end. Truman himself later described his vice presidency as the most useless job ever invented. He spent his days presiding over the Senate, attending ceremonial functions, and waiting. He had no idea what he was waiting for. By early 1945, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a dying man. Those who saw him up close were alarmed by his appearance. His face was gaunt, his hands trembled, and he struggled to concentrate during meetings. Yet the American public knew almost nothing of his condition. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Roosevelt met with Churchill and Stalin to plan the post-war world. Photographs from Yalta show a president visibly weakened. British officials privately expressed shock at Roosevelt's deterioration. Churchill's personal physician, Lord Moran, noted in his diary that Roosevelt appeared to have only months to live. Medical records now available reveal the extent of Roosevelt's illnesses. He suffered from severe cardiovascular disease, hypertension, congestive heart failure, and arteriosclerosis. His blood pressure readings in early 1945 were dangerously high, at times exceeding 240/130. Modern physicians who have reviewed his medical files conclude he should have been hospitalized, not leading a nation at war. Why was this information concealed? Partly it was Roosevelt's own decision. He was determined to see the war through to victory. Partly it reflected the culture of the presidency at that time. Leaders were expected to project strength, and any sign of weakness was hidden from public view. But the concealment also reflected the political establishment's calculation that Roosevelt remained indispensable. No one else, they believed, could manage the alliance with Churchill and Stalin. No one else could command the trust of the American people. Roosevelt's personal physician, Vice Admiral Ross McIntyre, repeatedly assured the press that the president was in good health. McIntyre was either incompetent or deliberately dishonest. Dr. Howard Bruen, the cardiologist treating Roosevelt, was forbidden from discussing the president's condition with anyone, including the vice president. The White House carefully managed Roosevelt's public appearances. Photographs were taken from flattering angles. Newsreel footage was edited. Reporters who noticed his decline were discouraged from writing about it. The result was a dangerous gap between reality and public perception. By March 1945, Roosevelt could barely work more than 4 hours a day. He traveled to his retreat in Warm Springs, Georgia, seeking rest. His staff hoped the warm climate would restore his strength. Instead, on the afternoon of April 12, 1945, while sitting for a portrait, Franklin Roosevelt collapsed. He died within hours of a massive cerebral hemorrhage. The concealment of Roosevelt's health crisis had a direct consequence. Harry Truman was utterly unprepared for what came next. April 12, 1945, began as an ordinary day for Vice President Truman. The Senate had adjourned early. Truman, who often felt restless in his ceremonial role, decided to visit the office of his friend, Speaker of the House Sam Rayburn, for their informal late afternoon gathering, what Rayburn called the Board of Education. It was here, in Rayburn's office in the Capitol building, that Truman relaxed with a few colleagues. They poured drinks, discussed legislation, and traded political gossip. It was the kind of informal setting Truman preferred, far removed from the stiff formality of official Washington. At approximately 5:25 p.m., the phone rang. Rayburn answered. It was Steve Early, Roosevelt's press secretary, asking urgently for the vice president. Truman took the phone. Early's voice was tense. He asked Truman to come to the White House immediately, and to come quietly, using the front entrance on Pennsylvania Avenue rather than the side entrance typically used by staff and officials. Early gave no explanation. Truman asked no questions, but he understood immediately that something was wrong. In Washington, protocol mattered. Vice presidents did not use the front entrance. The instructions suggested urgency and the need for visibility, preparation for a public announcement. Truman left the Capitol without his usual Secret Service detail, accompanied only by his driver. He did not inform his wife, Bess, who was back in their apartment. He later wrote that during the drive to the White House, his mind raced through possibilities. Had there been a major military defeat, an attack on American soil, an assassination attempt on Roosevelt? He did not allow himself to consider the most obvious possibility. The drive from the Capitol to the White House took less than 10 minutes. When Truman arrived at the North Portico at approximately 5:35 p.m., he was met by Steve Early and Brigadier General Edwin Watson. Roosevelt's military aide. Their faces told him everything. Truman was escorted upstairs to Eleanor Roosevelt's study on the second floor. Waiting there were Eleanor Roosevelt, her daughter, Anna Roosevelt Boettiger, and Colonel John Boettiger, Anna's husband, Steve. Early remained just outside. The room was quiet. Eleanor Roosevelt stepped forward. According to multiple accounts, she placed her hand gently on Truman's shoulder. Her voice was steady, the voice of a woman who had already composed herself in the face of unimaginable loss. She said, "Harry, the president is dead." Truman stood frozen. For a moment, he could not speak. Then he asked, "Is there anything I can do for you?" Eleanor Roosevelt's reply has become one of the most famous exchanges in American political history. She said, "Is there anything we can do for you? For you are the one in trouble now." Let us pause to consider the weight of those words. Eleanor Roosevelt, who had just lost her husband of 40 years, recognized immediately that Truman's burden was greater than her grief. She understood the enormity of what he was about to inherit. She understood that Truman had been kept in the dark by her husband's administration, and she understood that the war, the alliance, and the future of the nation now rested on the shoulders of a man unprepared for the task. Historians have analyzed this moment extensively. Some see it as an expression of Eleanor's characteristic grace under pressure. Others see it as a subtle rebuke, an acknowledgement that Roosevelt and his advisors had failed to prepare his successor. Still others see it as a moment of profound empathy, one leader recognizing the impossible position of another. What is certain is that Truman never forgot those words. He repeated them in interviews and in his memoirs. He told friends that Eleanor's statement captured the loneliness and terror of that moment better than anything else could. Within minutes, the room filled with officials. Secretary of State Edward Stettinius arrived. Press Secretary Early began coordinating announcements. Members of the cabinet were contacted and asked to assemble at the White House. Truman asked what arrangements needed to be made. He was told that Chief Justice Harlan Fiske Stone was being summoned to administer the oath of office. Truman asked if there were any pressing military matters requiring immediate decisions. He was told the military situation was stable, for now. But no one yet told him about the Manhattan Project. No one yet told him about the atomic bomb. Truman returned briefly to his apartment to inform his wife and daughter. Bess Truman later described her husband as pale and shaken. Margaret Truman, their daughter, recalled her father saying simply, "I'm going to need your help." At 7:09 p.m., less than 90 minutes after learning of Roosevelt's death, Harry S. Truman returned to the White House to take the oath of office. The news of Roosevelt's death spread rapidly. By 6 p.m., radio networks interrupted regular programming with the announcement. Across the United States, Americans stopped what they were doing. Many wept openly. Flags were lowered to half-staff. Businesses closed early. Churches opened for prayer services. In Congress, which had adjourned hours earlier, members began gathering spontaneously. The Senate would reconvene the following day to pass a resolution of mourning. Representatives spoke of Roosevelt's leadership during the Depression and the war. Many admitted they could not imagine the country without him. Outside the White House, crowds gathered in silence. Some stood for hours, unwilling to leave. Reporters described an eerie quiet. No one spoke above a whisper. It was as though the nation was holding its breath. Internationally, the reaction was immediate and profound. In London, Winston Churchill was informed of Roosevelt's death shortly after midnight British time. He later wrote that he felt as if he had been struck a physical blow. Churchill had worked closely with Roosevelt since 1940, coordinating the Anglo-American alliance. He feared that Roosevelt's death would unravel the careful diplomacy that had held the alliance together. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin received the news with what Soviet officials described as genuine emotion. Whether Stalin's grief was sincere or performative remains debated, but his concern about the alliance's future was real. Stalin had negotiated directly with Roosevelt at Tehran and Yalta. He did not know Truman and was uncertain whether the new president would honor Roosevelt's commitments. In Berlin, Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, briefly believed Roosevelt's death might save the Third Reich. He compared it to the death of Russian Empress Elizabeth in 1762, which saved Frederick the Great of Prussia during the 7 Years' War. Goebbels called Hitler to share the news, describing it as a miracle. Hitler, increasingly detached from reality, allowed himself a moment of hope. It was a delusion. The Third Reich had weeks, not months, remaining. Allied commanders in the field, Eisenhower in Europe, MacArthur in the Pacific, worried about continuity of strategy. Would Truman continue Roosevelt's policies? Would he maintain the priority of defeating Germany first? Would he support the planned invasion of Japan? No one knew. Truman had been excluded from strategic planning. The generals did not know him. The diplomats did not know him. Even his own cabinet did not know him. The world faced profound uncertainty at the moment it could least afford it. At 7:09 p.m. on April 12, 1945, in the cabinet room of the White House, Harry S. Truman raised his right hand and placed his left hand on a Bible held by his wife, Bess. Chief Justice Harlan Fiske Stone administered the oath of office. The room was crowded with cabinet members, White House staff, and a small number of reporters and photographers. The atmosphere was solemn. No one smiled. There was no applause when Truman finished reciting the oath. Truman stood before the assembled cabinet. His voice was quiet but steady. He said, "The world may be sure that we will prosecute the war on both fronts, East and West, with all the vigor we possess, to a successful conclusion." Then he added something more personal, more revealing. "Boys, if you ever pray, pray for me now. I don't know if you fellows ever had a load of hay fall on you, but when they told me yesterday what had happened, I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me. It was an extraordinary admission. Presidents are not supposed to express doubt or fear, especially in front of their cabinet and the press. But Truman's candor reflected both his personality and his genuine terror." He continued, "I have the most difficult job any man could have. I've got the most terribly responsible job a man ever had. But you've got to help me. I can't do this job alone." The cabinet members assured him of their support. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, Secretary of State Stettinius, Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, all pledged to help the new president navigate the transition. But Stimson knew something the others did not fully grasp. He knew that within hours he would need to inform Truman of the Manhattan Project, and he knew that revelation would dwarf everything else Truman had learned that day. The swearing-in ceremony lasted less than 20 minutes. Afterward, Truman held a brief cabinet meeting. He asked for updates on the war. He was told that American and Soviet forces were closing in on Berlin. He was told that planning for the invasion of Japan was proceeding. He was told that the United Nations conference in San Francisco would continue as scheduled. Everything seemed under control. It was an illusion. After the cabinet meeting concluded, after the reporters left, after the officials returned to their offices, Harry Truman went home. He and Bess returned to their modest apartment at 4701 Connecticut Avenue. Their daughter Margaret was waiting. The three of them sat together in the living room, no advisors, no Secret Service agents hovering. just a family trying to comprehend what had happened. Margaret Truman later wrote about that evening. She described her father as exhausted, overwhelmed, and visibly frightened. He sat slumped in his chair, unable to eat. Bess held his hand. They spoke little. What was there to say? Truman's private writings from that night reveal his state of mind. In his diary, he wrote, "I knew the president had a great many meetings with Churchill and Stalin. I was not familiar with any of these things, and it was really something to think about, but I decided the best thing to do was to go home and get as much rest as possible and face the music." Face the music. It's an ordinary phrase, almost casual, but it captures Truman's fatalism. He knew that the next day would bring challenges he could barely imagine. He knew he was unprepared. He knew the nation's fate rested on his ability to learn quickly and decide wisely. Friends who visited Truman that night described a man in shock. Senator Tom Connally, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, stopped by briefly. He later told reporters that Truman seemed like a man who had been hit by a thunderbolt. Eddie McKim, one of Truman's closest friends from his Army days, visited late in the evening. McKim found Truman sitting alone in the dark. Truman looked up and said, "Eddie, I'm not big enough for this job." McKim tried to reassure him, but Truman shook his head. "I don't know if I can do this," he said. It is important to understand that Truman's fear was not irrational. He was a student of history. He understood the presidency's weight. He understood that Lincoln, Wilson, and Roosevelt had been extraordinary figures who rose to meet extraordinary challenges. Truman did not see himself as extraordinary. He saw himself as a senator from Missouri, a former haberdasher, a political foot soldier who had never expected or wanted this responsibility. And yet, history had chosen him. That night, Truman slept little. He knew that the next morning would bring briefings on military strategy, intelligence reports, diplomatic cables. He knew he would need to make decisions affecting millions of lives. What he did not know, what he could not have imagined, was that within hours he would learn of a weapon capable of destroying entire cities. On the morning of April 13th, 1945, less than 24 hours after taking the oath of office, Harry Truman received the most consequential briefing of his presidency. Secretary of War Henry Stimson requested an urgent private meeting. Stimson was 77 years old, a veteran of Republican and Democratic administrations, a man known for his integrity and discretion. He carried with him a single sheet of paper. Stimson entered the Oval Office. He closed the door. He asked that they speak alone. No aides, no stenographers. What he was about to reveal was so secret that fewer than a dozen people in the government knew its full scope. Stimson began carefully. He told Truman that the United States had been developing a new weapon of unprecedented power. The project, called the Manhattan Project, had been underway since 1942. It had cost nearly $2 billion, an astronomical sum equivalent to roughly $30 billion today. It employed over 130,000 people working at secret facilities in Tennessee, Washington State, and New Mexico. Truman listened, his face expressionless. Stimson continued. This weapon, he explained, was based on atomic fission, the splitting of uranium or plutonium atoms to release enormous energy. A single bomb, small enough to be carried by one aircraft, could destroy an entire city. Truman asked questions. How close was the weapon to completion? Stimson told him the first bomb would be ready for testing within months. How powerful was it? Stimson said the scientists estimated it would have the explosive force of thousands of tons of TNT, perhaps as much as 20,000 tons. Truman struggled to comprehend the scale. 20,000 tons of TNT in a single bomb? It seemed impossible. Stimson handed Truman a memorandum summarizing the project. The memo, classified top secret, described the weapon's development, its potential military applications, and the profound ethical questions it raised. Stimson then addressed the larger implications. He told Truman that this weapon would change warfare forever. It would give the United States the power to end the war with Japan quickly, but it would also introduce a destructive capability unlike anything in human history. Stimson added a warning. The Soviet Union was already attempting to develop its own atomic bomb. The scientists believed it was only a matter of time before other nations possessed this technology. The United States faced a choice: use the weapon to end the war and establish post-war dominance, or risk allowing other powers to develop it first. Truman's reaction, documented by Stimson in his diary, was one of stunned silence. He read the memorandum carefully. He asked Stimson to brief him further. In the coming days, he said he needed time to think. After Stimson left, Truman sat alone in the Oval Office. He later told aides that learning about the atomic bomb was more shocking than learning of Roosevelt's death. At least Roosevelt's death, however sudden, was comprehensible. The atomic bomb defied comprehension. We know from Truman's private writings that he immediately grasped the weapon's moral dimensions. He understood that using it would kill tens of thousands of civilians. He understood that it would set a precedent for future warfare. He understood that it might make traditional diplomacy obsolete. But he also understood that refusing to use it might prolong the war, costing hundreds of thousands of American lives in a planned invasion of Japan. It was a decision no president should have to make, and Truman had less than 4 months to prepare for it. In the days following Franklin Roosevelt's death, Eleanor Roosevelt played a quiet but significant role in stabilizing the transition. She remained at the White House for several days, overseeing the preparations for her husband's funeral, while also making herself available to Truman and his staff. She understood the continuity of government mattered more than her personal grief. Eleanor met with Truman multiple times during that first week. She provided insights into Franklin's thinking on key issues. She shared observations about Churchill, Stalin, and other world leaders. She offered advice on managing the White House staff and the press. Crucially, she did not interfere. She made clear that Truman was now president and that she supported his authority completely. Her conduct set a standard for presidential transitions that would be followed by future first ladies. Years later, Eleanor was asked about her famous statement to Truman, "You are the one in trouble now." She explained that she had meant it sincerely, without irony or bitterness. She said, "I realized that Harry Truman, in a matter of hours, had gone from being a relatively obscure vice president to being responsible for ending the war, managing the peace, and leading the free world. He had not been prepared for this. Franklin had not prepared him. I felt genuine sympathy for him." Historians have noted that Eleanor's graciousness stood in contrast to the behavior of some of Roosevelt's senior advisors, who treated Truman with condescension. Men like Harry Hopkins, who had been Roosevelt's closest confidant, initially resisted Truman's authority. Hopkins believed, incorrectly, that Truman lacked the sophistication to manage complex diplomatic negotiations. Eleanor's support helped legitimize Truman's presidency during those critical early days. Her endorsement mattered to the Roosevelt coalition, to the Democratic Party, and to the American public. Eleanor Roosevelt would go on to serve as a delegate to the United Nations, where she played a leading role in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Her partnership with Truman, though brief, was a model of dignified political transition during a time of crisis. And her words to Truman on that first day "You are the one in trouble now," would be remembered as a profound expression of empathy and political wisdom. Harry Truman's first day as president remains one of the most consequential 24 hours in American history. In that brief span, Truman transitioned from political obscurity to global leadership. He learned that he would be responsible for ending the most destructive war in human history. He discovered that the United States possessed a weapon capable of unprecedented devastation, and he confronted the reality that he had been utterly unprepared by the administration he now led. Historians have debated for decades whether Roosevelt should have done more to prepare Truman. Some argue that Roosevelt's secrecy was necessary to protect wartime security. Others contend that Roosevelt's arrogance and poor health created a dangerous gap in presidential succession. What is clear is that Truman rose to meet the challenge. Within months, he would make the decision to use atomic bombs against Japan. He would confront Stalin at the Potsdam Conference. He would oversee the creation of the United Nations. He would initiate the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe. He would contain Soviet expansion through the Truman Doctrine. None of this was foreordained. Truman might have faltered. He might have been overwhelmed by the magnitude of his responsibilities. He might have made catastrophic errors. Instead, Truman became one of the most consequential presidents of the 20th century, not because he was extraordinary when he entered office, but because he refused to be paralyzed by doubt. Eleanor Roosevelt's words to Truman, "You are the one in trouble now," have taken on symbolic meaning far beyond their immediate context. They represent the burden of democratic leadership, the expectation that ordinary citizens, thrust into extraordinary circumstances, will rise to meet the needs of their nation. Truman's first day reminds us that history is shaped not only by the prepared and the powerful, but also by those who, without warning or preparation, must make decisions that will affect millions of lives. It reminds us that institutions matter, that the peaceful transfer of power, even in the midst of global war, is one of democracy's greatest achievements. And it reminds us that leadership is often less about confidence than about courage, the courage to admit fear, to ask for help, and to carry the weight of impossible choices. On April 12, 1945, Harry Truman walked into the White House as a frightened, unprepared vice president. He walked out as the President of the United States, carrying a burden no one should bear alone. The world, as Eleanor Roosevelt understood, had fallen on his shoulders. And somehow, he did not collapse.